Speaker. Last night, a man sleeping rough on Parliament's doorstep died. This is the second time that this has happened. Now, I know that individual MPs and staff do what they can to help people. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I wonder if you're aware of any strategy that Parliament might be seeking to put in place to support people who are homeless. And I also wonder if there has been any indication from ministers that they will be making a statement on this tragedy and on their failure to address the crisis of homelessness that we see every day in our communities up and down the country.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her point of order and for bringing to the attention of the House the tragedy of the loss of life of someone who has been homeless and sleeping rough here. And I'm sure that the whole House will join me in saying how sorry we are that something like that has happened. The Honourable Lady has asked me if I'm aware that whether ministers are likely to come forward with plans to deal with homelessness. I understand that the Secretary of State might well be coming forward with such plans, but I have no formal indication as to when or in what form that might be. But the Honourable Lady has made some very important points. I'm quite sure that the Treasury bench has heard them and that the ministers with responsibility will come to know very quickly about what the Honourable Lady has drawn to the attention of the House. And if by no other means, I will make sure that they know about it. And I have every confidence that ministers will take into consideration what the Honourable Lady has said this evening in making future plans. Thank you. We now come to the backbench motion on cumulative impact assessment of changes to disability support. And before I call Debbie Abrams to move the motion, it might be helpful for the House if I explain that as the debate under Standing Order 24 began at precisely 4:24 p.m, the backbench business may therefore continue until 9:36 p.m. I understand that the second debate, which was on the order paper under backbench business, and I am happily getting assent from the chairman of the Backbench Business Committee, for which I thank him. I understand that that second debate will not be moved today. So to move the first debate, I call Debbie Abrams.
I beg to move the motion in my name on the order of paper and in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Stretford and Elmston. And it's indeed a great pleasure. It's a long day for everybody, but I do appreciate that we have been able to hold this debate today. It is so important to the millions of disabled people who many of whom will be watching today. And we actually put this application into the Backbench Business Committee back in June. I'm very grateful to them for supporting this. But 6 months on, a lot has marched on. So just to refresh everybody's memory, back in 2013, nearly 105,000 people signed a petition launched by the War on Welfare campaign, WOW for short, that called on the government to carry out a cumulative impact assessment, CIA, of government cuts on disabled people. And back in February 2014, we held that debate, and to be fair, members from across the House were raising their alarm about the cumulative effects of austerity on disabled people. And the government's response at the time was very disappointing. It was denial that the public spending cuts in social security, but also across other government departments, were having such a detrimental impact on disabled people. And they also said that cumulative impact assessment methodology was very difficult. I have to say at the time, also, scope and demos research estimated their cumulative effects of the 2012 Welfare Reform Act changes alone. And this amounted to £28 billion worth of cuts on 3.7 million people. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is abundantly clear from the numerous inquiries, reports and analyses, as well as the personal testimonies of disabled people themselves, that austerity is doing immense harm to disabled people and their families and carers. And I'm going to expand on this in a moment, if I may, Madam Deputy Speaker, but first I'd like to clarify exactly what Cumulative Impact Assessment is, or CIA. It's a mouthful to keep saying that every time. It involves various methods and processes to assess the overall effect of a set of changes, for example, government policies such as tax or welfare reforms, on a particular population. In this case, we're talking about disabled people. The assessment can quantify these impacts, for example, looking at the net changes in income, but it can also use qualitative methods to understand how these policy changes affect disabled people or other groups. Impact assessments as a whole are decision-making tools. They should inform policy development based on the evidence and findings that the assessment presents, but they can also be used retrospectively. The power of CIA is that they take a number of policies together to see how they impact on each other. I believe passionately in evidence-based policy, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think too often it's the other way around. It's policy-based evidence. We select the evidence that suits the policies that we want to, and CIAs can help avoid this. For me, they're an essential component of open and transparent policy making. If a politician says they want to tackle, for example, burning injustices in society, CIAs will say if the policy programme can achieve that or not. So they're also a way of holding politicians to account.
Honourable friend, give way.
I will.
Thank you, Honourable friend, for giving way. We should bear in mind that at least in 2 general elections, the government wanted to save about $12 billion on the welfare budget. So all these systems are really geared towards that end. That's why we have major problem with universal credits. But with people with disabilities, with the issues with the independent living allowance that really unsettled a lot of families, to say the least about that. But more importantly, every so often, a person that's got disabilities is subject to a review, and that again causes great anxiety, and in some instances, at least the mental stress and strain. It's not a very, very fair system, and the private sector shouldn't be involved in that, because it's very much about saving money at the end of the day.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and yes, I'm going to come on to exactly some of the points that he has raised there. He managed to get quite a bit in that intervention. So what CIAs have been done so far? Well, back in March this year, the Equality and Human Rights Commission published their report on the cumulative impact of tax and welfare reforms. This looked at the effects since 2010 of tax, welfare, social security and public spending on protected characteristics as set out in the 2010 Equality Act. And this included assessing the impacts on disabled people. They looked at the measures introduced in both the 2012 and 2016 Welfare Acts, including the move to personal independence payments from disability living allowance, the cuts in support to the employment support allowance work-related activity group, the introduction of universal credit, which involved the removal of the severe and enhanced disability premiums for universal credit, the freeze in uprating social security support payments, and more. The HRC analysis found that by 2021, households with at least one disabled adult and a disabled child will lose over £6,500 a year. That's 13% of their income. Households with 6 or more disabilities lose out of almost £3,150 a year. And disabled lone parents, predominantly women, with at least one disabled child, lose almost £10,000 of their net income. £10,000.
Would my honourable friend give way?
I will indeed.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. She is outlining analysis of the loss of income experienced by disabled people, but I know she will also want to acknowledge the work of the Social Metrics Commission, led by Baroness Stroud in the other place, which has also identified the additional costs that are experienced by disabled people, and which has properly, or more accurately, therefore portrayed the poverty that they experience compared with some of the measures we've been able to use previously. Does she agree that a cumulative assessment is actually about drawing together many different ways of measuring the impact of cuts, changes in access to public services and the additional costs that disabled people and their families experience?
My honourable friend makes an absolutely essential point. I'm going to come on in a moment to the poverty that disabled people are facing by virtue of the additional costs that they face. But you're right that there are a whole range of different methods that can be used, and we need to look at all of those to ensure that we can fully understand the impacts on disabled people. I will indeed.
Thank you very much. And my honourable friend is setting out an excellent case for what cumulative impact assessments can achieve. Would she agree with me that actually the holistic impact of other cuts, particularly to our health services, I'm seeing GPs in my constituency who are refusing to write fit notes or assessments for medical evidence for people. We're seeing voluntary services being cut, community transport, befriending services, leaving people with disabilities feeling utterly isolated, alone and bereft.
Absolutely. Again, my honourable friend makes such an essential point, and that is sort of the basis for the UN committee investigating breaches around the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. They were finding these issues as well. So that was the HRC's cumulative impact assessment back in March, and although October's budget made some changes to universal credit, as the Office for Budgetary Responsibility Analysis showed, this restores just half of what was cut in 2015, and only marginally helps those disabled people who are able to work. For those too ill to work, analysis by Policy and Practice shows that they will be financially worse off compared with legacy benefits. And I think what's so important from today's Social Select Committee report as well, they confirm the issues that many of us have already been raising about the proposed managed migration of disabled people onto a universal credit, and that it needs to be stopped, but also that we need to ensure that the natural migration, so-called natural migration, resulting when there's a change of circumstances, need to be properly looked at. But in addition to the changes in universal credit, it needs to be mentioned that there were absolutely no other measures for disabled people in the budget. In fact, the OBR report showed that disabled people were set to lose more social security support by 2022. So, for example, personal independence payment spending is down to be £1 billion less in 2022 compared with March this year. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm sure the government will say that they are helping disabled people improve their living standards by getting them into work. However, only just over 51% of 4 million disabled people of working age are in employment, compared with 81% of non-disabled people. A disability employment gap of just over 30%, and a figure which has barely narrowed since 2015, when the Conservative Party manifesto pledged to halve this gap. And as we also know, there are over 8 million households with at least one person in work who's in poverty, who's living in poverty. So, work is not, as is frequently said on the other side, a route out of poverty. Last year, the government set more modest ambitions with a new target to get 1 million more disabled people into work. But even this needs a radical rethink. There are many reasons the disability employment gap has hardly reduced in the last 3 years, and that includes the lack of information and advice for employers. But we must remember that discrimination of disabled workers is still quite prevalent. 15% of disabled people revealed in a recent survey that they had been discriminated against when applying for a job, and 1 in 5 while they're in work. Information is not enough to address this. It needs leadership and it needs cultural change.
Would my honourable friend have weight?
I will, very
And would she agree, therefore, that a cumulative impact assessment would also identify the lack of access now to legal aid, where people may need to take forward discrimination cases in employment?
Absolutely. I mean, I was going to mention about the cuts around employment tribunals, which I think have reduced by 80% since the cuts to legal aid. And this, again, a cumulative impact assessment would enable us to see the impacts there. With the best will in the world, the Disability Confidence Scheme just does not cut it. There needs to be a commitment to expand and properly resource access to work, supporting under 34,000 disabled people a year at and into work is a drop in the ocean when there are over 2 million unemployed disabled people wanting to work. But as you know, Madam Deputy Speaker, not all disabled people are able to work. The consequences of the inadequate support that is now made available through our social security system is that 4.3 million sick and disabled people are living in poverty. And as my honourable friend mentioned before, disabled people are twice as likely to live in persistent poverty as non-disabled people. 80% of disability-related poverty is because of the additional costs that they face by virtue of their disability. And that's been estimated at, on average, £570 a month. The cuts in social security means that more and more disabled people are becoming isolated in their own home as their mobility vehicles or personal support are taken from them. Many are struggling to pay their rents or mortgages. Their health conditions have deteriorated and other conditions have developed, including mental health conditions, as they face the relentless stress and anxiety resulting from a social security system that is hostile, unsupportive and even dehumanising. The sanctions regime, which has affected over 1 million disabled people since 2010, the work capability and personal independence payment assessment processes are all part of this. It is quite frankly grotesque that people with progressive conditions such as motor neuron disease have until last month been habitually forced through the personal independent assessment process. And I understand, and I'd be interested in the Minister's response to this, that there are still issues with it, and although, as I say, last month this was meant to have stopped. But there's also overwhelming evidence of the inaccuracies, some have called them lies, in these assessment reports. Why has the government not been able to act on this? With over 70% of assessment appeals successful, whatever contract management processes the government has in place, they're clearly not fit for purpose. All of these government social security changes will have a huge toll on the health, well-being and even the longevity of disabled people. A peer review study from my former colleague Ben Barr and colleagues showed the detrimental mental health effects of the work capability assessment, including being independently associated with an increase in suicides. On top of this, the government's own data revealed that the death rates for people on incapacity benefit and employment support allowance were 4.3 times higher than the general population. People in the ESA support group are 6.3 times more likely to die than the general population. And in the work-related activity group, they are twice as likely to die as the general population. Madam Deputy Speaker, I reported these back in 2015. People on IB, on ESA, are poorly. They are not feckless, as too many people have tried to suggest. But again, the government didn't listen and went on to push disabled people originally assessed as not fit for work and in the support group through another work capability assessment process into the RAG group and then cut their support by £1,500 a year in 2016. If she wouldn't mind, I'm going to, because I'm conscious that I need to make progress. Last month's British Medical Journal reported that from King's College and other research centres showed the impact of social care cuts on additional deaths for disabled adults and older people. They estimated that for every £10 per head cut in social care, there are five additional deaths. By 2020, they estimate 150,000 additional deaths from 2014 trends. I'll just let that sink in. 150,000 additional deaths. Madam Deputy Speaker, national and international organisations have also called on the government to undertake a cumulative impact assessment of the effects and cuts to disabled people. These include the government's own Social Security Advisory Committee, the House of Lords Select Committee on the 2010 Equality Act and Disability, the UN Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and last month, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. But I'd like to refresh everyone's memory of last year's findings from the UN Committee investigating breaches to the UN Convention of the Rights of Disabled People, Persons with Disability, as they call it, since 2010. And these are breaches by this government. They said that the government was responsible for grave and systemic violations of the rights of disabled people, and that these failures amounted to a human catastrophe. Although they highlighted the poverty and shocking impact of cuts on disabled people's ability to live adequately and independently, they went beyond social protection and social care issues, listing 60 recommendations right across all the articles of the Convention, all government departments, from accessible physical environments to education and to access to justice. A key recommendation was that the UN CRPD should be enshrined in UK law. The UN Committee also expressed concerns regarding how the terms under which the UK leaves the European Union could affect disabled people. And I noted with alarm the leaked DWP report in last week's Times, which also suggests this. Since the 1990s, the UK has trailed behind Europe on the rights of disabled people. The government's refusal earlier this year to protect the rights of disabled people by incorporating the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights into UK law as we leave the EU was deeply, deeply disappointing. My other concern is how disabled people, who have been very poorly served by this government, will do with an even weaker economy. In all the exit scenarios from credible analysts, the economy shrinks both in the short and long term compared with our current relationship with the EU. Madam Deputy Speaker, disabled people have been at the back of the queue in public spending terms since 2010. What will happen to them with an even smaller spending pot? Although a Labour government would make different political choices to tackle poverty and inequality, with lower levels of economic growth, how quickly we can do this will be a real issue if we're to stick to the fiscal rules we set out in last year's general election. I've been contacted in preparation for this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, by hundreds of sick and disabled people in recent days with their stories of how these cuts have affected them. And I'd like to share a few of these with you now. I'll be very brief because I know time is at a premium. Elle, who is a single mum in Oldham, contacted my office recently after her UC was suddenly stopped. She was told it was because her son, who has severe learning disabilities, and Elle as the carer for, had reached his 19th birthday. This change in circumstances meant that her son had to make his own claim. Unfortunately, no one had told Elle this. Instead, they just stopped her support payments. She was lucky. Her family helped her out for the 5 weeks until she had her payment reinstated. But she told me, at times I just wanted to end it all. It's just so hard and I get no support or respite. Another of my constituents, John, was refusing to have life-saving surgery he needed for a brain tumour because he was worried he would be sanctioned. He'd been sanctioned for 3 months earlier in the year because he didn't attend a work capability assessment, although he'd explained it was because of his treatment for his tumour. Beth told me I was contributing £82.50 a month for my care in 2017, but then I was told that my contribution needed to increase and I would have to pay £81 a week. Nothing in my financial circumstances, such as my PIP award, had changed, so I queried the increase and was told it was correct. Now I have no money for my medication or the aids I need. The impact on me has been increased pain, isolation and anxiety. Beth has spina bifida, fibromyalgia and anxiety disorder. Dawn moved from one local authority to another and fell foul of the change in circumstances rule, was put on UC and lost a disability premium of £64 a week. Lee, who has severe mental health problems, was subject to 7 assessments, 7 in 6 years. Jane lost a mobility car after a PIP assessment, found that her degenerative condition wasn't considered bad enough, and now she has to rely on her friends and family for help. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is happening up and down the country. The despair in the messages is palpable, and I would urge everyone to read the WOW Campaign Voices ebook, which has collated these experiences. It's so moving. Madam Deputy Speaker, we are the
5th richest country in the world, and how this government has treated our disabled people shames us all. We must never forget that 9 out of 10 disabilities are acquired. Any one of us could have an accident or contract an illness. Like the NHS, our social security system should be there for all of us in our time of need. People should not be vilified by a system that is meant to be there to support them. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe that in addition to understanding the cumulative impact assessment of government policy, as the motion sets out, we also need to radically transform our social security system and develop a new social contract with the British people. And I know my honourable friends on the front bench have been working on this. But since 2010, we've seen social security spending cuts by nearly £40 billion and another £12 billion planned by 2022. Although the Labour manifesto last year including our disability manifesto, which I was proud to write, was a start, we need to do much more, and I know that this is recognised, and particularly regarding the less than financial adequacy in the social security system. We cannot expect people who are living in such hardship, in such poverty, to wait for a few years for a real living wage to kick in. And what about the disabled people who can't work? The 1942 Beveridge Report was the basis for a new welfare state set up after the Second World War, when the debt to GDP ratio was over 250%. Under Beveridge, we established the NHS in 1948, expanded social security and our education system. It was heralded as a revolutionary system that would provide income security for its citizens as part of a comprehensive policy of social progress. But since then, society has changed. The pressures from globalisation, automation and an ageing society means that we need to develop a new sustainable social security system that we can be proud of. We need a new Beveridge Report for the 21st century, defining a new social contract with the British people, addressing the poverty, inequalities and indignity millions of people, disabled and non-disabled, young and old, men and women, are enduring, bringing hope to a new generation as it did 76 years ago. The poverty and inequalities disabled people are facing are unacceptable, but they are not inevitable. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The question is, as on the order paper, Bill Grant.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth, and may I commend her on the passionate speech that she's just completed. In recent months, much has been said of the ongoing changes to the social security system. Indeed, some members opposite continually focus on the negative experiences to the exclusion of the positive aspects of change. I cannot agree with that often gloomy assessment, however well intended. Indeed, I was pleased to note when speaking to those in my constituency who deal with the delivery of a changing welfare system at the job centre every working day, and also who dealt with the previous clumsy, fragmented social security system. Staff are enthusiastic about the changes going forward and advise me that the government did listen to them in the long journey, and it continues to listen when areas of improvement are identified. With the wholesale replacement of an entire welfare system that was tired and not fit for purpose, such gradual improvements are not surprising, and indeed are an indication that the government continues to listen to feedback from those best placed to offer it. Those work coaches dealing with cases each and every day now have a greater flexibility to help vulnerable individuals, assisting with each in a different way, tailored to their particular circumstances, allowing coaches to focus on the most pertinent cases, while those claimants who are demonstrating their familiarity with the system through their daily work diary can be left to a degree, for the most part, to navigate the system by themselves, but bearing in mind that assistance must always be available to them if required. Indeed.
The Honourable Member is making some points about the universal credit system, but that system isn't accessible by 50% of disabled people who are unable to access it online or through the work journal, and in my area are seeing home visits not allowed either. What does the Honourable Member say to those people who can't access such a system?
Positive to those cases, but I can relate to my own experience. Yeah, I can only relate to my own experience where we have outreach workers that go and assist these individuals, and that assistance must be given when requested. And I find that I'm saddened if that is the case in your area. I am proud of the staff in Ayr and other local job centres. But like many members here, I did have concerns that the implementation of such comprehensive system may lead to errors, human or indeed systemic, in the support given, particularly to vulnerable and disabled claimants. Indeed, I have referred to these concerns previously in this very chamber. However, I have been assured by recent measures, particularly those announced in the budget, to ensure support during that transition. The additional £1 billion over 5 years to support the transition is especially welcome, but I would accept that more would be welcome in that regard. I was likewise concerned by allegations of failings in the health assessments required under the Personal Independent Payment Scheme. But an inspection and a closer look at figures, this pessimism is not supported. I understand only 4% of, there is a degree of pessimism, of initial decisions, only 4% are overturned at appeal. Of course, we have all dealt with specific cases where errors have indeed been made and hopefully rectified. But the overall figures are encouraging. I'll just repeat, the overall figures are encouraging, and we need to monitor what we're doing to understand what we're doing, with almost 90% being satisfied with the PIP claim process. Something which is often overlooked, sadly in my view, is the flexibility for those with disabilities returning to work, encouraged by the revised welfare system. Where previously they were rigid rules, very rigid rules, there is now the flexibility to allow a phased reduction in benefits while a person builds up the hours and confidence in their new role. This can be a challenging but yet rewarding event for the individual. This is a sensible element of the new system in helping people back into work where appropriate, and one I very much support. The Disability Confidence Scheme, it's been with us for a number of years, also assists greatly with this process. And can I commend employers throughout the length and breadth of the country for embracing this excellent system. And may I also note at this juncture, I note disability benefits are not covered by the benefits cap, and that is rightly so.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. And in relation to the Disability Confidence Scheme, would you also recommend that MPs should be joining the Disability Confidence Scheme and trying to ensure that they engage in practices of employment that supports people with disabilities to come into work in the House of Commons, such as the Speaker's internship scheme, which has also been extended to include placements for people with disabilities, which is an excellent scheme. And would he also suggest that we should be looking at people with disabilities not just as employees but also as employers and doing all we can to support their progress?
Thank you very much for that intervention, and I wholly agree with the Honourable Lady. Yes, we should be trailblazers or setting examples by giving employment to those who are seeking employment and want to contribute to society. And yes, and broaden that about as best we can. We should also be encouraging, as I'm sure the Honourable Lady does, encourage our local employers to take on board and to build that bridge between the person who is really employable and wants to work and the opportunity for the employer, maybe for a minor adjustment to the workplace, can accommodate a disabled person. And thank you for that intervention. But I'm sure the honourable members will be encouraged to note that the United Kingdom, this proud nation of ours, the spending on disability and health conditions is the second highest of the G7. Universal credit is a comprehensive system, bringing about the much needed modernisation of a dated and discredited welfare system. Yet I have not found it to be the draconian approach some have suggested. Their experience of it are clearly different to mine, and I am encouraged by the much greater flexibility it offers in helping people return, where appropriate, to the dignity and self-esteem that employment must surely bring. I am optimistic about its future, and should ministers continue as they have thus far to listen and respond to concerns or suggestions from members of this House, job centre staff, and most importantly, those who are themselves reliant on the support afforded by the welfare system in the United Kingdom. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Helen Goodman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to begin by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth, and to thank the Backbench Business Committee for ensuring that we have this important debate. I was somewhat taken aback by the roseate picture that the member for Carrick and Cumnock gave us. It doesn't square with my own experience in my constituency, and I want to outline why that is. The problem of cuts to disability benefits has affected a lot of my constituents very badly indeed. And this is in large part because although Durham is no longer a mining area, there is a legacy of heavy industry in our area. And the healthy life expectancy across the country as a whole may be 69 years, but in County Durham it's 59. So this means that many people under pension age are in need of support from the social security system, and they need disability benefits. One of the problems, obviously, is the interaction with other parts of the benefit system. These are serious and complex. So to go back to the issue of the bedroom tax, which we debated at length in 2014, obviously this has affected adversely those people who needed a spare room for a carer in their family, which they are now financially penalised for using. Another group of people who are badly affected are the WASPy women. These people, I had a fantastic meeting with 300 WASPy women in my constituency. Now, some people who turned up were hale and hearty, but a considerable number of people turned up who were seriously ill and had disabilities, and some of these people had been at work at the age of 15, and their bodies are now worn out. And the Minister must know that this is an issue, because she will have seen the very significant increase in the number of women over the age of 55 who've had to go on to ESA. One woman recently came to see me. She'd had to stop work because she had cancer, and her doctor said she could no longer do a part-time job. Because her job had been part-time, she wasn't entitled to contributory ESA. Because she had an occupational pension of £60 a week, she is not entitled to any other money from the social security system. Another family came to see me. The mother had been disqualified for benefit when she moved from DLA to PIP. And at the stroke of a pen, she lost that benefit. Her son lost carer's allowance, and they lost housing benefit. They were losing £8,000 a year. Their income was just being halved by the change in assessment. Then, as my honourable friend said, we have the whole problem of the Motability cuts. Now, everybody wants to help and support people who go out to work when they have a disability. And the cuts to Motability have been one of the most destructive, futile and pointless cuts one could possibly dream up. A young woman came to see me. She had dwarfism. She had succeeded in getting a university degree and holding down a job. When her Motability was taken from her, of course her whole life was put into chaos. Then we have the benefit freezes, which adversely affect this group of people. We're now seeing people with disabilities and chronic illnesses moved onto universal credit, gradually at first, but I know more in future. This means that this is another group of people who are going to be suffering from the delays in benefit payments and the debt that people are pushed into. So when ministers talk about being fiscally responsible and having a welfare cut and the fantastic savings they've got out of the social security budget, the truth is these savings have been achieved on the backs of people like my constituents with severe disabilities and health problems. I want to talk in particular about the move from DLA to PIP and ESA. Now, I cannot think of a worse named benefit than PIP. It's not really personal, it doesn't give people independence, and there isn't much of a payment if you do manage to get it. There's massive confusion among the public when they thought that they were entitled to DLA for life. Some people were in receipt of higher level DLA, and then they get 0 points and no PIP whatsoever. My constituency caseworker, who has dealt with hundreds of cases over the last couple of years, has an 82% success record on appeals. Now, no benefit where you are getting the decisions overturned 82% of the time.
Is she aware of the fact that 75% of PIP decisions and 74% of ESA decisions were overturned on appeal in Wales in 2017? Doesn't that lead her to the conclusion that this is an utterly dysfunctional and shambolic system, which is a huge waste of resources and of taxpayers' money? So it's not only callous and cruel, it is also not value for money.
Well, my honourable friend has expressed it very well. I didn't know those Welsh statistics, but they're obviously it's obviously a very similar experience in Wales and in Durham. And perhaps that's not surprising because it's another area with a heavy industry legacy that people are coping with.
Would you give way?
I'm happy to give way.
Where I'm from, again, in Swansea, we've got a situation where some of the most vulnerable people are going through a dreadful anguish and anxiety, thinking though they're chronically ill, they think they won't end up with benefits. And isn't this part of a wider strategy, basically to squeeze the poorest and most vulnerable to pay for the bankers' greed that led to the 2008 financial crisis?
Well, I mean, it is extraordinary that the government have been able to find money to cut inheritance tax for the richest, but can't find money for people with disabilities and mental health problems. So, as my honourable friends have said, the stress and distress caused, particularly to people with mental health problems, are a serious problem. People are put into a situation of tension because they don't know when or whether they're going to be reassessed. And I have constituents who are concerned for their family members' well-being because they get so anxious because they can't face these work capability assessments. Now, if I could just turn to the problem of ESA. The Honourable Member for Ayr was talking about how we need to encourage and support people to go back to work. And this is indeed true. But the fact is, from the point of view of an employer, employing people with disabilities means higher employee liability insurance. It means adjustments at work very often, and there is simply no incentive for people. The Minister is saying rubbish from a sedentary position. Would he like to come to the dispatch box and tell me why that is rubbish?
Both as a Member of Parliament in my constituency office and as somebody who ran a business for 10 years, I employed disabled people and I benefited. It takes good employers to have a wide-ranging workforce, and if you get it right, it's a win-win for everybody. I don't recognise the situation that the Honourable Lady is saying.
Well, that is I'm glad that the Honourable Gentleman did what he did, but we do also hear from people who can't get jobs because of their disabilities, and we do also hear from employers who say it is too expensive to make the adjustments.
thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Just on that point about it being too expensive, does she then recognise the support to work schemes that have been introduced by this government, which now reach £57,000 per employee, which can help negate some of those costs and support disabled people in their work?
If those schemes were so good, then the number of people with disabilities who are in work, the rate of those people would have gone up. But as my honourable friend who opened the debate pointed out, that proportion has not increased one jot in the last 8 years. So let me talk...
My honourable friend, I'm grateful to her for giving way. She's right about that. And of course, she'll recall that the gap between the employment rate of disabled people and the overall average was falling steadily until 2010. It's flatlined ever since. Does she share my disappointment that the government no longer has a target for reducing the disability employment gap, the target initially set by David Cameron but since abandoned, unfortunately?
Well, my honourable friend who has a proud record as a minister tackling these issues when we had a Labour government has pointed out that the twists and turns of policy, and it is patently ridiculous for ministers following the UN report to be complacent in this area. There is no room for complacency whatsoever. Let me turn to the problem of employment support allowance and illustrate the difficulties with some stories of constituents of mine. Mrs M, who is 63, had to stop working as a carer through ill health. She was signed off by her GP. She has Paget's disease, a tumour on her leg. She sees an oncologist. She needs a new hip. She's seeing a surgeon with because she needs a new knee. She has heart arrhythmia on the left side and sees a cardiologist about this. She was refused ESA at assessment and had to apply for JSA and was advised to apply for jobs as a roofer, bouncer, or consider retraining as a social worker. Well, obviously, we supported her appeal and ESA was awarded. This is patently ridiculous that people have to go through this sort of thing. Take Mr. C. Mr. C was 60. He had previously been awarded DLA following a series of strokes. He was transferred to PIP in January 2018, awarded a high rate for both care and mobility. He put in an ESA assessment request in September 2018, but he got confused because all his medical information had been sent to DWP for the PIP assessment, and he was then expected to pay again for the medical evidence to submit for the ESA application. Now, why can't the department sort out its administration instead of putting these financial burdens onto our vulnerable constituents? Then we come to Mr. I. Mr. I is 64. He was previously awarded PIP. He was reassessed in September 2018. The award was unchanged, 8 points for mobility because he cannot move unaided for 50 metres. His ESA assessment in October 2018 also failed because he can move to 200 metres using a wheelchair. He's currently awaiting a mandatory reconsideration. And one of the confusions here, of course, is that people simply can't understand how they can be awarded a high award in the PIP assessment and then be required to work when they come to the ESA assessment. The things just don't stack up. And one of the reasons they don't stack up is because of the amateurish and unqualified nature of the staff doing the assessments. This has been a problem from the off with this, and ministers have had 8 years to sort it out, in which time they have failed. Let me tell the story of Mr. J. Mr. J is autistic and has various mental impairments. He was getting DLA, he was moved over to PIP. He applied for ESA and placed in the support group. He was unaware that his ESA was contribution-based, not income-based. And so when he went to the chemist and was given the prescription form, he ticked the box because he had previously been entitled to free prescriptions and was no longer. So his mother, they got the fine, which they had to pay in the family. His mother had to intervene and become the appointee to deal with the issue, since he was plainly not capable of doing it himself. Now, Mr. J is not a one-off. Mr. J is not unusual. 5 years ago, 30,000 people in this country were fined for falsely saying that they were entitled to NHS prescriptions. Last year it was 1 million, and it was 1 million because the Department of Health and the Department of Work and Pensions are not properly coordinated. The Department of Work and Pensions do not give people the information they need when they get their benefits, and the Department of Health are hounding them for money. Now, for the Minister, on a nice ministerial salary of £98,000 a year, maybe a £100 fine isn't a lot. But for people who are on incomes of £100, £150, that's a whole week's income. This is a complete disgrace. It is utterly careless. We have brought this to ministers for the last 6 months. They've still not sorted it out. I am not saying that ministers set out to fine 1 million people. Of course not. That would be a ridiculous assertion. But sometimes it's culpable to be careless, and this government is careless of disabled people.
Giles Watling.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. If I may, I'd like to bring the debate back to the actual motion, which is commissioning an independent assessment of the cumulative impact of changes to the social security system. And it's an important issue, and it's quite right that we should discuss this today. I must say that it's an honour to follow the impassioned speech for the member for Bishop Auckland. Of course, we must ensure that the social security system works for everyone. It should be a safety net to help those who have fallen on hard times. But it should also help people to stand on their own 2 feet. And for those who can't, it should be there to support people who have fallen on hard times to lead decent lives. So if we are properly to consider this motion today, we must recognise that because of this government, disability spending will be higher in every year to 2020 relative to both 2010 and today. And thanks to the government's reforms, the average weekly award of PIP is over £13 higher than it was on the old DLA, and 87% of claimants say they're satisfied with their claimant journey. And in this year alone, £50 billion will be spent to support people with disabilities and health conditions. There are more achievements that I could stand here and natter on about, but for the sake of brevity, I will just say that this government does have a strong track record on disability support. Moreover, the NHS, which has now been given a record level of funding thanks to this government, will continue to offer unparalleled care to people with poor health. And as for carers, since 2010, the rate of carers allowance, CA, has increased from £116 to £120, meaning there's more support available for carers, and this has grown faster than wages. In the context of today's motion, I come back to that again, it is certainly good news, and these changes will almost certainly have a positive impact within the wider social security system, and will benefit sick and disabled people, their families and carers. And I don't think we need an independent assessment to tell us that. Now, a quick point, if I may, about universal credit, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now, I believe that any social security system should be looking to help people into work and giving them that satisfaction, rather than creating yet another culture of dependency that this country simply cannot afford. It's estimated that universal credit will help 200,000 more people into work when fully rolled out, and will empower people to work an extra 113 million hours per year. And for disabled people specifically, they have a boosted income of around £110 a month, thanks to increased support under universal credit. In fact, on a recent visit to my local job centre, my staff and I found that the majority of claimants in my constituency are happy with universal credit, and according to job centre staff. In fact, the staff there are really happy to be dealing with it. They prefer it to the old legacy benefits. Although in Clacton I did have one case recently of a disabled gentleman who was struggling to find outreach support from the job centre. Now, with the assistance of a local councillor, we were able to assist this gentleman, and I raised the case, and this point was brought up earlier, of outreach and getting to know what is available at the job centre. And I raised this case with the Secretary of State this week, and I'm pleased that she said she would look at ways to promote that outreach so that people are aware of the services that are offered at our job centres. Madam Deputy Speaker, well, of course I'll give way. I'd be happy to.
Thank you very much. And the honourable gentleman is painting an extremely rosy picture of circumstances in Clacton. Is he aware of the visit to Clacton of the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty a month ago, and the report that he made of the very serious poverty he found there and the lack of support for people, including those with disabilities?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. Yes, of course I'm aware of the visit of the UN Rapporteur, who I met for 2 hours, and he spent, I think, 2 hours in Jaywick, where there are problems, absolutely, and he arrived, he spoke to the people of Jaywick, and he went away in 2 hours. Total disrespect for the staff, and the officers of the local council have been working so hard for so long to improve the situation in Jaywick. We are building 10 more houses there. 5 for council houses, 5 for starter homes. We have bought 30 hectares of land, and we are expanding our works in Jaywick, and things in Jaywick are improving. Moreover, what the rapporteur's visit did for the people of Jaywick is it irritated them greatly that somebody yet again has come to Jaywick, looked at it and said, look at this is a bad place to live. No, it's not. It's a wonderful place to live with a wonderful community who are on the up at the moment. Now, I'm sorry, I come back to my... thank you for the intervention. I enjoyed that hugely. But I'd like to come back to our party's history on disabled support. We were the party that introduced the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995, a groundbreaking act that was subsequently amended and replaced by the Equality Act of 2010. And on the specific point about an independent assessment, it is because of the change of legislative changes that we started. All departments and public bodies now have a responsibility for considering and monitoring the impact of policies on disabled people. This is the case for all policy, not just disability-related policies. Finally, and this is the crucial point, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we were to commission this assessment, we must recognise that the DWP does not believe it is methodologically sound to publish a cumulative impact separately for disabled people. And the main reasons are that the department's survey data is limited, particularly in capturing the severity of the disability. And because most people live in households with others, the department does not know how incomes are shared. It is very hard to look at the effects of separately for the disabled. And this will be the case for an independent body too. So there is no point in commissioning what would be a flawed and inaccurate assessment. This helps nobody. Thank you.
Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I appreciate my colleague from Alderbees and Saddleworth for securing this important debate, and I appreciate the Backbench Business Committee granting it. It's an interesting one because there are some elements of universal credit I support. I remember supporting it in the coalition. There were elements of it that I pointed out at the time that would cause problems. Some of what I said was taken on board. Unfortunately, some wasn't, and we reaped the whirlwind all these years later. I was disappointed on universal credit that a key element of it, which I supported avidly, was around working allowance, that was cut to ribbons in 2015, but I was delighted only a few months ago if not the full amount was restored, 1.9 billion or 1.7 billion was. So, you know, there's a bit of progress. Now, the main reason I'm supporting this debate, and I worked with my honourable friend, even though different parties, on the Work and Pension Select Committee in 2010-2015, and we saw a lot of things in the same light. And so for that, that's one of the reasons why I actually think the request and the requirement today is not unreasonable. If you have a disability, and particularly if you're someone who either was born with a disability or acquired it when you're very, very young, the challenge of getting into work is really difficult. I know that hugely. I've been working in this area for over 30 years. In fact, it's quite interesting with all the kerfuffle that we had earlier. I've been hard of hearing for 50 years, so I'm quite a good lip speaker, but I have kept silent over the issue. I decided there was enough sturm and drang without me chucking into it, so I'm going to rise above that. One of the challenges if you're disabled is that you face barriers to employment, you face barriers to education. There are a lot of different barriers. And I think it was a minister or one of the honourable members opposite made the very true point that it was actually the Conservatives in the early 90s who introduced the DDA. I know that well because I helped campaign for it all those years ago when I was young and had no grey hair. I met John Major at the time. And very impressive he was on this issue, I have to tell you. And the DDA was a game changer, huge game changer, because without that law, I don't think we'd have made anywhere near the advances around disability discrimination, both on services and employment, that we've made. However, there's still such a long way to go. There is such a long way to go. And that's often because people don't understand, they really don't understand the barriers to, say, employment for disabled people. They will often, governments of all sides will often point out all the areas where someone acquires a disability in work, but under the DDA they keep their job. That's a great thing, that's really important. But actually, I know loads of disabled people who would give their right arm to be given a job, to get in the door. When you don't have a disability but sadly acquire it through illness or what have you, the system is much better now at protecting you. It really is, and that's a fantastic progress. What it doesn't do, and this has barely changed in the years I've been in politics and the years before when I was involved in this area, it's still incredibly hard if you are disabled to get a job. Incredibly hard. Now, if on top of that, you have, in my view, what was a fundamentally unwise move by the DWP a couple of years ago, before the present ministers were in situ, is that they changed elements of the work capability assessment they still have a support group and a couple of the other groups, but what they did is that they changed the, I can't remember the quite name, the part of the ASA that's helping people, disabled people get work, is they changed the income so it's the same as JCA or only just above, away from the higher amount in the support group. Now, I can tell you that was such a foolish move. I remember I wasn't MP then because I briefly, after 2015, wasn't an MP for 2 years till I won it back. And I remember at the time writing to my colleagues and writing to the then ministers, pointing out that if you remove that additional payment for disabled people who agree they're prepared to try and find work with support, if you take their income down to 20% almost, less than what it was, and that it is in the support group, human nature is human nature. What people will do is they will strive darn hard to get in the support group, because that's not wrong, that's what happens. If I've been off work for 5, 6, 7 years, but I'm persuaded by my work coach, the Job Centre Plus, to go into an ESA cohort that gives me a little more money than pure GSA, a little less than support group, but more money than JSA, I'm willing to go into that group A, because there's more income, B, because the work coach is there to help me try to get into work. If you then change the rules, which means my money is exactly the same as it would be in JSA, I'll tell you what I'll do, I'm going to try and stay in the support group. That's what you do. That's human nature. That's what I would do. It's bonkers not to be perfectly honest. So that was really frustrating, and I'm unsurprised to see over the ensuing couple of years since I've come back that there have been real problems in that area, and a lot of people have been moving over to the support group where perhaps they wouldn't have been. You then still have really odd anomalies. I was talking to a constituent recently, I've been helping a constituent recently, as with my office, I try where I can to provide support at tribunals. So one of my team, and I'm training up a second member, they go and act as advocates at tribunals. And we had one recently where this chap had been working for the DWP locally, the Job Centre Plus, for X number of years. Unfortunately, he became ill. DWP did their best to work him through that process, so I'm not knocking that. But after a period of a couple of years, it was clear his illness was stopping him working effectively or even part-time, so he was let go under a proper due process. I have no complaints, neither did he. 2 years later, he's on ESA, he's off to a work capability assessment, and the reason being is that the DWP system saying, no, you're not disabled enough to have these benefits. So he was disabled enough to be made redundant, but not disabled enough a few years later to actually get the benefits. It was ridiculous. I don't believe it was a conspiracy. I believe it was classic, dim bureaucracy. Anyway, my colleague joined him in the tribunal. Bang, we won it. And he's getting all the benefits that he is entitled to. My point behind that is that clunkiness happens more often if you're disabled. It just does, folks. I know so much about this subject with so many thousands of people I've worked with over years. And so that's why I believe it needs an assessment, you see. And I don't think that's unreasonable. I really don't. I don't agree with all the things that it requires on here. My colleague from Oldham East and Saddleworth would be surprised if I agreed with her on everything. But I agree with her on this. We need an assessment specifically around, an impact assessment specifically around disabled people and the impact the changes are having. Because if we don't do that, I do fear for the million migration, the really huge migration, even though I do accept that the government has been making improvements to universal credit. It's a bit through gritted teeth sometimes from the government, but they have, it is, Minister, trust me. But they are making some good amendments. That's why I don't think it's unreasonable for this assessment. I think it should be independent. I think it should be focused on disabled people. Yes, I will. So if I give way to my...
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. I wondered if he was aware of the Centre for Welfare Reform's recent publication of its analysis of the government's reasons for not producing a CIA. In summary, the Centre found no good reason for the government not to evaluate the combined impact of its own policies.
I thank the honourable member for intervention. I wasn't aware of that, and that makes my case perfectly, because as my honourable friend knows, that a good lobby group, but from a different perspective. It's from right of centre. So what we've got is possibly left of centre, which is an empty void these days, but that's by the by, and right of centre saying to the government, have that impact assessment. Yes, certainly.
Would the honourable gentleman not agree that if the impact assessment is based on faulty data and therefore would come up with sort of faulty answers, it's not worth having?
I thank the honourable member for his intervention, and I say with genuine respect, I think the government department spinning to my honourable friend on that. I know a lot about stats, I know a lot about disability stats, I know a lot about all the different government DWP and disability stats. And so I'm afraid on that one, I do not believe personally that it would be beyond the wit of man to come up with a model that actually gets over the particular hurdle he's talking about. My view is that that hurdle is not as dramatic as the DWP is saying. We may have to agree to disagree, but I genuinely believe that, having worked a lot over the years with different governments within the DWP. So I'll close. I know there are others who wish to speak. I do not believe this is an unreasonable request. I actually think it would do the government credit to accept it. And on that basis, I hope the Minister's listening. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Luke Graham.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the member for Eastbourne, who's clearly well informed in these issues and shares a similar love of statistics with myself. I congratulate the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth for bringing this debate here this evening. And one point I would make, because it's been made by opposition members of Parliament, is talking about the UN report on supposed complacency on these benches. And I have to be clear, in the 18 months I've been here, not one of me and my colleagues have been complacent about the welfare policies that we see play out in our constituency every single day. And I am very clear, and as I'll go on to elaborate in my speech, exactly some of the areas where I think we're doing quite well and other areas where there's still scope for further reform, as I'm sure other colleagues want to work with me and, of course, the Ministers in trying to deliver. So, obviously, we're having this debate on the backdrop of significant changes to our welfare policy. We've had the DLA phased through to PIP, along with the attendance allowance for pensioners with care needs. And we've seen a big difference in the way the money is being spent as well. Some points have been made by opposition politicians tonight saying that, criticising the government, saying that costs have been cut on the backs of the most vulnerable in our society. Well, I've heard this allegation made against government ministers time and time again. That's why I went to the House of Commons Library to look at the overall expenditure that's taking place within our welfare system. And when you break it down, you look at it in 2009-10, it was only DLA. We didn't have PIP in 2009-10. Around 10.3 billion was being spent. Now, when you add together and look at 2017-2018, DLA plus PIP, around £16 billion are being spent. So in cash terms, this is not a reduction in overall expenditure. And also, one of the opposition MPs, who I know she's no longer in her place, but saying that we're cutting costs on the back of the most vulnerable, it's not fair and it's not accurate. I would ask opposition that if we're going to have a proper debate on and help the most vulnerable in our society, we should actually speak to the right facts. And these facts and statistics have come up time and time again as an issue just this week in this House. I think we owe it to all our constituents. I will give way, just let me take my point. We owe it to all our constituents to speak to the facts. And again, if you dispute them, take it up with the House of Commons Library. We've also, the problem with about some of these, bear with me one moment, we'll let you in. When you're looking at how these policies have come across, not only have they changed in the way the money is being distributed, but also how services are being delivered. And what's happened with a lot of the welfare reform, and I've seen it in my constituents that have come through to my office, is that many people have been on legacy benefits for the very first time are having some of those assumptions challenged and are being asked for reassessments. Now, sometimes that is for good, but sometimes I can see where there has been a detrimental impact, where they've fallen through the different changes, they've had a change of circumstance, they may have been changing between counties or in different parts of the country, and that has had a negative impact on them as well. And that is why we've been raising questions in this House and raising issues with ministers to try and tackle these issues. I will give way.
The honourable gentleman tell me how many disabled people in 2009 were supported through the social security system and how many are supported now. It's important to have the denominator value so that you have a rate and not just cash values.
I couldn't agree more. And what I found really interesting when you went through these figures, we've got an increase of, I think, around 800,000 of people in 1664 who are now being classified as disabled. But I understand they were having previous classifications within the welfare system and receiving different benefits. So I don't think it's a simple change in the denominator, which should then indicate the impact. But also, I would also refer to the government commitments that they've made about making sure that people are receiving cash benefits. Well, no, I think it's a fair point. You asked me a direct point, I gave you a direct answer. And again, I'll happily go on the debate about the number of people that are now being classified as disabled. But there have been some positive movements in some of these in some of the changes that have been put forward by the government. We have seen an employment rate for disabled people go up from 43% to 51%, something that is welcomed. We've seen the Access to Work scheme, which I referred to earlier, which had 104 million going in 16-17, providing support to around 25,000 people. But again, none of us are complacent on this side of the House. We are very, very clear that changes still need to be made. And I know from a number of my constituents that have come into me talking about their experience through the assessment process, taking me through the actual paperwork, which I have gone through with a page-by-page of them to understand where they're having the difficulties. You can see that some of these changes have brought people into our offices. They've brought them into the welfare system that for a long time they've lagged in the dark, where actually now assumptions are being challenged, new benefits are being offered, and as a result, new questions are coming from our constituents, where I think we should try and answer as best as we can. I will give way.
Honourable Member for giving way, and I commend him for far more honest portrayal of his experience from his constituents from that side of the House. But can I just challenge the point that he made earlier on the figures? Of course, when you refer to these figures, you've been somewhat selective. The rate of inflation, costs have risen since 2010, so naturally the costs and the actual output and spend that you refer to will obviously be higher, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not disproportionately affecting people. Do you agree?
I would say that when you're looking at a 38% increase in cash terms, when they do the compound inflation rate over the same period, that would be less than 38%. So I'm happy to go through the calculations with her separately, but I don't think you would still actually have a real terms increase in the benefits that are being paid out. Madam Deputy Speaker, if you also look at the same time, with all of these policies, we're very, as constituency MPs, we see every day that comes into my staff and myself in my Alloa office and in my Crieff office, we see some of the human impact of some of the changes that are made in welfare. And I say again, and I actually am supportive of looking at how we assess the impacts on disabled people, because we are putting a considerable amount of money. My honourable friend from Air Carrick and Cumnock raised the point about the amount that's being spent on disabled benefits, and we are one of the highest spenders in the developed world, which I think is something that should be applauded. But if it isn't getting to the right people at the right time, then we need to see exactly how that is being administered and how our services are being delivered on the front line right across our country. And what I would say is that, I was lucky enough, like other members here, have hosted debates on Disability Confident. It is a fantastic scheme. The honourable member opposite raised earlier about how MPs should be signing up for that. My office is a member of the Disability Confident scheme, as I know are other colleagues right across the House. And what I can say is that Disability Competency, the Minister visited Glenalmond Timber in my constituency, and just one point that I hope everyone will be able to join with me is congratulating Jed Gardner, who's the production manager at Glenalmond Timber, who's now got the Disability Confident Leader status, the first in Scotland. So I hope you'd all join me in congratulating him for the fantastic work they're doing in Medvan of giving people with disabilities opportunities to work, which again, when I visited the company and when the Minister did too, you can clearly see the impact it has not only on the individual, but their family and their friends. So there's some incredible positive work being done by this government, as well as areas, as I said earlier, that we do need to put under continual review and indeed assess. Is the Minister? No, okay, there's some water. Also, further to that, Madam Deputy Speaker, in my constituency, we also recently held an event, a joint event with a member from Stirling on Disability Confident in Alloa, in which we had local community groups attend, the DWP attend, and it was hosted in Inglewood House, which I'm glad to say, following that event, they immediately signed up to the Disability Confident scheme, which again, I think is an incredibly positive action and shows that companies in Clackmannanshire and Perth and Kinross are actually taking a government initiative from the green benches here and actually applying it in a daily way that you can actually see real improvement for our constituents' lives. I do have a number of concerns, as I said earlier, about how the assessments are taking place, and I actually would be supportive of looking at having an assessment of how these are being delivered. I'd hope to work with my government colleagues about how this would be, and I would hope it would be independent or certainly objective to make sure that our constituents and our government and ourselves will have the best possible view about how these disability benefits are being delivered. I'm conscious of time, but I will give way quickly. Yep.
Gentlemen would agree with the recommendation of the Work and Pensions Select Committee in their report this week that while waiting for a work capability assessment, it is unreasonable of the department not to pay universal credit, because that is leaving people high and dry.
Yes, and if you want a short answer, yes. And also when we're talking about, I led the inquiry on universal credit in the Public Accounts Committee, and I'd refer any member to the House to the inquiry and the subsequent report from the Public Accounts Committee about where we identified the strengths and shortfalls of the universal credit system. And I hope hope government colleagues will have read that report and taken those recommendations into account. Madam Deputy Speaker, I would just like to come on to just one or two final points just before surmising, and that is the issue about, we've talked a lot about statistics earlier. One concern I have, and it's often not appreciated in this House of Commons, is that through the devolution of certain levels of statistics around the country, often we've now got different levels of government within the United Kingdom producing different statistics, which makes like-for-like comparisons quite difficult. In preparation for this debate tonight and the mental health debate that was pulled earlier, I actually had struggled getting figures from the House of Commons Library because in Scotland we're not going along with certain NHS frameworks, quality for delivery frameworks now, and what we need to be able to is, even if different parts of the United Kingdom and different levels of government use different methods, we have to find a statistical method to be able to find a uniform measure so we can actually have meaningful debate in this place. Otherwise, we're not comparing apple to apples, and it means we can't actually get a real view of how services are being delivered for our constituents. And so in that same vein as well, and this is a debate that has happened in the past, but it will be ongoing in this place, I'm sure, in the coming years, is about the devolution of welfare powers. And I have to say, I have a real concern about the devolution of welfare powers, not because it's one of, I think powers should all remain here and I want to sit on the green bench throne. It's because actually, when you're speaking to the most vulnerable people in our constituencies, as I know every member in this House does, the idea of adding in another agency or one or two agencies into this equation would make it even more difficult for them to get the help that they need. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is an issue. I do actually support that we should have an objective assessment of what these changes are doing for our constituents and for the most vulnerable. We are spending the money, but we've got to make sure it's going to the right place. For too long, benefits have become a party political issue. And I think when it comes to disability and helping the most vulnerable in our society, we can look past our parties and deliver for our constituents.
Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to congratulate the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth and the member for Stretford and Urmston for securing this important debate. On a daily basis, my office sees firsthand the horrendous and appalling impact the government's changes to the social security system have had on some of the most vulnerable people in my Aberavon constituency. Many of my constituents who come to my advice surgeries are usually at their wits' end, worried that their benefits are going to be stopped and that they won't be able to pay their rent or put food on the table for their children. We've seen hundreds of vulnerable constituents put through the humiliation of shambolic health assessments which cast doubt on their physical disabilities or mental health issues. And following that humiliation is the awful uncertainty and fear of the appeals process, which we almost always win. Some people have been awarded no points following PIP or ESA assessments, when quite clearly they are struggling with a disability or information has been inaccurately recorded. This has eroded confidence, not only in the assessment process, but in the whole system. And universal credit has landed people in rent arrears for the very first time. Some of their experiences are simply harrowing. In one case, a woman suffering with a degenerative disc condition for 27 years, along with depression and anxiety, waited over a year for her ESA assessment, only to have it cancelled on the day. A month later, she was assessed, but the anxiety and stress of the wait, followed by the degrading assessment itself, led to a mini-stroke 2 days after the assessment. She now has high blood pressure, which puts her at risk of a further stroke. Despite all that, she was put onto the work-related category. That decision was overturned following a mandatory reconsideration. And she's not alone in having to go through this process. 75% of PIP decisions and 74% of ESA decisions were overturned on appeal in Wales in 2017. This high rate is symptomatic of the fundamental flaws in the initial assessment process. If the correct decisions were made from the outset, then a lot of the misery, worry and suffering would be avoided. When you raise these problems with government, you get the same response time after time, that the government don't recognise these big problems and will carry on regardless. It's like an ostrich with its head buried in the sand. But that is indicative of the government's track record. Carry on until you are shamed into doing something about it. But what can be more shaming than when a United Nations poverty envoy says that changes to social security have meant that great misery has also been inflicted unnecessarily, especially on working poor, on single mothers struggling against mighty odds, on people with disabilities who are already marginalised, and on millions of children who are being locked into a cycle of poverty, is what was published in the report. It is appalling and inexcusable that this is happening in a G7 country. Our social security system is there as a safety net for the most vulnerable. Right now, that safety net is failing. MPs, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and the United Nations have all called on the government to conduct a cumulative impact assessment. If the government is so confident that they're doing the right thing, then they have nothing to fear over commissioning this assessment. But ultimately, the government must stop burying its head in the sand over this and wake up to the reality that their punitive and callous policies are causing misery and hardship to hundreds of my constituents and hundreds of thousands of people around this country. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Karen Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I very much want to thank my honourable friend from Oldham East and Saddleworth and the Backbench Committee for bringing this debate before Parliament, because it does allow us to shine a spotlight on the experiences of our constituents who are living with a long-term illness or disability and who are relying on financial support from the government. Now, support has dwindled for these people in recent years, with nearly 6,000 people in Bristol South who are currently claiming employment and support allowance because they are unable to work because of illness or disability. The national evidence is already clear. The cumulative impact of tax and welfare reforms report published earlier this year by the Equality and Human Rights Commission found that changes to taxes, benefits, tax credits and universal credit announced since 2010 affect the poorest hardest, and the ill or disabled people are some of the worst hit. But this isn't just a loss of income, shocking as it is, that impacts on disabled people. There is something very wrong with the government's instructions to staff in the DWP and the culture that is being created within the department, because the number of constituents in Bristol South who've been forced to appeal, initially refused employment and support allowance or personal dependent payments, is appalling, as others have mentioned. Now, the fantastic work that is done by the South Bristol Advice Service based in Withywood, they do a great job in supporting those who need help. But the determination required simply to make a claim is often too much for those suffering with long-term conditions or life-changing illnesses. And there is little evidence of compassion in the system. Sadly, universal credit is making that situation worse, both in financial terms and the complexity of the claims process. And the government has already admitted that the most disabled people's incomes will not be fully protected. And already I'm seeing constituents who are losing out simply because of change in their circumstances. Now, promises about future backdated transitional payments ring hollow when you can't afford the rent because your universal claim is in disarray 3 months after moving to a bungalow adapted for a disability. Rent arrears have spiralled in one case because a blind constituent was informed only in writing that universal credit now included an element for rent. No one contacted her to inform her verbally. Now, I do want to pay tribute to the persistence and resilience of my constituents who daily face the challenge of their medical conditions and who must also deal with the current system. I applaud those who have come to accept that actually a mandatory reconsideration and an appeal to Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service are just part of the claims process. And my constituent who informed me that he has completed his 3rd successful appeal has my admiration and my respect. But I know that there are far too many others who simply don't carry on with their claim, who get ground down by the bureaucracy, who miss out on vital financial support and whose health, as others have mentioned, suffers greatly as a consequence. Of course, the government should commission an independent cumulative assessment of the impact of changes in the social security system on sick and disabled people, their families and carers. But they should also act now, immediately, to stop the rollout of universal credit to ill or disabled people.
Ruth George.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government side appear to be arguing that there should not be a cumulative impact assessment on disabled people, as my honourable friend for Oldham East and Saddleworth has argued so eloquently. But there's plenty of figures out there, so I'm glad the Minister's disagreeing, and I very much hope that she will put me right and that she will agree to this happening. Because we already know that 30% of families with someone with a disability are in poverty, and that's 10% higher than the rest of the population. In fact, half of people in poverty, according to the Social Mobility Commission, nearly 7 million are in a household with an adult with a disability. So fixing the problems of poverty for people with disability will go a long way to fixing the problems of the UK's high level of poverty. We've seen successive cuts to benefits that affect people with disabilities over the last 8 years. From 2013, we saw a 1% benefit uprating for 3 years. Employment and support allowance lost over 5% of its value compared to RPI, 3% compared to CPI. The 4-year benefits freeze will take off 6.5% compared to CPI, and a full 10% of the value of that benefit compared to retail price index. 15% of the value of that benefit lost over 7 years. These are not generous benefits in the first place. But in addition, many disabled people have had to cope with the cuts to local housing allowance, down to 30% of median rent, so they have to bulk up their rent out of their meagre allowances for ESA. Child tax credit has been frozen as well. The childcare element in tax credits has been the same maximum since 2005, and the percentage reduced from 80% to 70%. In addition, we've seen the bedroom tax, which affects so many people with disabilities, and the work-related activity group £30 under ESA abolished. People with disabilities have been facing all of those cuts before we even see the cuts under universal credit. And it's for this reason that people with disabilities feel so strongly that there needs to be a cumulative impact assessment of the full impact of this history of serious cuts to their income. Under universal credit, we're also seeing cuts to children with disabilities. The government claims to support and protect the most vulnerable in society, but as my constituent, a single parent with a son with a disability, wrote to me, he said, "My son is 6 years old. He is practically bedbound. Yet the government wants to transfer me onto universal credit because I can no longer work and to support him, and his support will be reduced." If my disabled son is not one of the most vulnerable people who needs protection and support, then who is? And I would put that question to the Minister today. The difficulties in claiming universal credit for people with disability have been set out in many cases elsewhere, but because at the moment rollout has been mostly to people who've been on JSA and not to people who've been on employment and support allowance who have got disabilities, we haven't seen the scale of support that's needed. But I'm already in my constituency, as I mentioned earlier, seeing problems with people with disabilities getting home visits that they feel that they need. Families in particular are feeling the cuts, and parents who are disabled with children who are disabled as well. My honourable friend set out the appalling level of cuts of nearly £10,000 a year that those families will see the reduction in their income under universal credit. It's no wonder that families fear for universal credit. A constituent wrote to me with a 4-year-old son who's autistic and non-verbal. She's had to give up work in order to care for him because she can't get care in the school holidays. So as well as losing her own wage, they've also lost tax credits. They looked to claim housing benefit but found that they would need to claim universal credit instead. Because they've already racked up rent arrears, because their income's been so reduced, if they face 5 weeks' wait for support under universal credit, by that time my constituent says they could end up losing the house they've been a tenant in for the last 21 years. I hope that the government will be listening to these real stories of people who are suffering already. I've only had universal credit in my constituency in High Peak for just 2.5 months, and already I am seeing constituents who are suffering under it. But that's on top of all the constituents who are suffering from employment support allowance and PIP assessments. And in the Work and Pensions Select Committee, I set out to the Minister the experience, the very harrowing experience that I heard of a group of survivors of sexual violence and their experiences of the PIP assessments. How one woman was curled up on the floor crying and sobbing uncontrollably. The assessor simply repeated the questions at her deadpan, offered her no support or understanding whatsoever. I was very pleased that the Minister agreed with me at that point that that is a disgusting situation that should not be allowed to continue. And in response to the Work and Pensions Select Committee's report on PIP and ESA assessments, the government promised to look at the recording of those assessments as a matter of fact and to bring that in. But on questioning the Permanent Secretary today in Select Committee, we heard that he has no idea how that is being rolled out when a commitment was made 8 months ago to do that. There are still people suffering because of the lack of appointments. My constituent who was looking to claim PIP said that she was forced to purchase her own recording equipment if she wanted her assessment to be recorded, whereas in the past she knows that the assessment centre have used their own equipment. She was also looking to get support with getting to the assessment centre. She was told that she could get there in a taxi, but that it would cost £100 up front. She could only claim that back 30 days later after her assessment. So people with disabilities are not being treated in the way that they should be treated. And that is possibly part of the problem, but I'm afraid it's a culture that we're coming across time and time again in our surgeries and from our constituents. In PIP assessments, the Disability Benefits Consortium found that 8 out of 10 people who underwent an assessment found it made their health worse. 2/3 felt that they'd been poorly assessed. Constituents, particularly with mental health difficulties, find that those difficulties are not adequately assessed. My constituent said that the bulk of the questions she was asked, although she presented with serious mental health difficulties, were aimed at her physical health, where she only has minor conditions that don't prevent her working, and only 1/3 of the time was spent on covering her mental health. Those questions were loaded, and when she tried to expand and explain her answers, she was told to stick to the questions. My constituent has been left on the verge of suicide from that assessment and the struggle of waiting for a response for what will happen to it. And as my honourable friend set out so starkly, then there has been an increase in suicides from people who have been undergoing work capability and PIP assessments. None of us want to see this happen. I raised again in committee with the Minister that constituents of mine were being asked why they had not yet committed suicide. I'm very pleased that the Minister again took that back, and from the cases that I've received more recently, that question has not come up again. So I very much hope that that practice is spreading through the privatised companies that do these assessments. But there's so much more to do, as cases just from my one very rural, relatively affluent constituency show. Yes.
I thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. She's making an extremely powerful speech. In relation to the assessments, as Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Disability, we've also been hearing that there are particular difficulties for people with acquired brain injury and also epilepsy in relation to the types of questions that have been asked. And I'm wondering if she would agree with me that perhaps the assessment should be more sensitive in relation to the different types of disabilities that present.
Thank you very much. And Honourable Friend makes a very relevant point that certainly from the evidence that my constituents with mental health and with brain injuries bring to me, then the assessment centres on physical health and physical difficulties. And I know from my time, 20 years working for the Shop Workers Union, USDOR, that work is not easy these days for people to do, particularly if you've got a long-term health condition. Employers now have sickness absence procedures where you often can't have more than 3 periods of sickness absence, however short, in any 6-month period. And if you have a disability, particularly if it's one where you don't have a union representative who can support you under the Equalities Act, then people with disabilities are simply slipping through the net and not performing and being left out of the workplace. And unfortunately, universal credit and the cuts to that benefit is going to trap people with disabilities more without work, because if they at the moment are on a higher level benefit with premiums in there, if they take up a short-term period of work, as one of my constituents has, who took on a job working for the Royal Mail over the Christmas period for 6 weeks, he felt relatively well in himself and wanted to do that job. He's just found out that when he finishes that job, he will be transferred onto universal credit and he will lose his transitional protection and his support. So it's not a message that is telling people with disabilities, try and work, try and do your best. And we see even more problems with the system where people with disabilities are being refused work capability assessments and are not seeing any money at all. One of my constituents was presented to me by a support charity 6 months ago. They'd been trying for 6 months to get him some money since he'd failed his ESA. He had a fit note. He should have been getting money. Only with my intervention did he get support. That was 6 months that he was living off our friends and family and from food bank parcels. Yes.
For giving way. I wonder whether she saw the comment made by Professor Alston in his report, and I quote, "Great misery has also been inflicted unnecessarily on people with disabilities who are already marginalised." Ministers have sought to dismiss those criticisms, but doesn't that actually sum up pretty well the experience of a very large number of the people up and down the country?
Thank you very much to my honourable friend for making that important point, which was going to be the point on which I ended my speech, with quoting from a constituent with a disability who wrote to me to say she set out the experience that she'd had. She wasn't asking for support. She was able to fight the system. But she said, the reason I'm writing to you is to encourage you to keep fighting for us in Westminster, to be the voice that is taken away from the disabled people in this country. Please fight to put an end to this barbaric, humiliating assessment system, where the person who makes life or death decisions doesn't even get to meet you, isn't medically qualified, specific to the individual condition, and is meeting targets to refuse claims. That is the view that is out there amongst people with disabilities. They want Parliament to be seen to be supporting them. Of the changes that came in the budget to universal credit, they did not affect people with disabilities, some of those who are worst impacted by cuts to universal credit. So I very much hope that the Minister and the Government will be listening. Thank you.
Jim Shannon.
Sorry, Madam Speaker, I thought the Honourable Lady was... apologies for that there. First of all, just say that I'm very pleased to make a contribution and congratulate the Honourable Lady for Oldham East and Saddleworth and congratulate her in bringing this debate to the House for consideration. Benefits are the biggest, massive issue in my office. I have one member of staff who does nothing else but deals with benefits. That's 5 days a week, and to be honest, Madam Deputy Speaker, she actually works outside of her hours because she's a compassionate lady and spends that time. The rest of us in the office, myself, have done DLA appeals, still continue to do them. We do the benefit systems as well, and these are incredibly difficult issues. Government has indicated that they will review some of the universal credit, can I say that couldn't come soon enough? But I want to, before I start, Madam Deputy Speaker, just say to the Minister who's in his place and the Minister who has left, but will no doubt be back shortly, that I'm not saying this to give you a big head, but I just want to say these things in advance of the comments that I'll make, to say that both Ministers are very affable, they're very engaging, they do try to address the issues, and I know that because I've spoken to them both, and they've come to me to say, look, if there's anything at all that you want to speak about, please speak to us about those things. So while they're both keen and eager to help, I have to say this, and I want to say that in advance, because I don't want them to think I'm attacking them, because I'm not attacking them. But I have to say that there's things that I have to say tonight about universal credit and where it is, and the fact that it's having an impact upon my constituents. And it'd be remiss of me to come to this chamber, Madam Deputy Speaker, and not to say that. So I want to say that first, to know that you always respond, and you know that because I've spoken to you before about it. But nonetheless, we are where we are on these issues. I just want to speak about the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and they had a very, very in-depth analysis, one that I've read and which others have read as well. Indeed, I think some of the members, right honourable members, have referred to it. They showed that in the bottom two parts, the deciles will lose on average approximately 10% of their net income, with much smaller losses for those higher up the income distribution. Negative impacts are particularly large for households with more disabled members and individuals with more severe disabilities, as well as for lone parents and low incomes. For some family types, these losses represent an extremely large percentage of income. For example, for households with at least one disabled adult and a disabled child, average annual cash losses will be just over £6,500, over 13% of the average net income. And here's a specific one, because I have some Bangladeshi people from Bangladesh in my constituency, but the impact of changes to direct taxes and benefits is to reduce the income of Bangladeshi households by some £4,400 per year on average. So these are specific things, and I want to come and say these things, Madam Deputy Speaker, in a very constructive way to the Minister, because I know he responds, and that's why I'm happy to say these things, because I know he'll come back, as he always does. At an individual level, women will lose on average considerably more from changes to direct taxes and benefits than men. Women will lose some £400 per week or per year on average, and men will lose some £30. Absolutely, yeah.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. He's making a very, very powerful point. And the figures that my honourable friend is talking about, they're true in my constituency as well. I know one family that's losing just under £500 a month. The reality is, we all know in the chamber that these are substantial sums of money for some of our poorest disabled fellow citizens. There's no point arguing about it anymore. That's why I think the request from my honourable friend Oldham East and Saddleworth for an independent impact assessment is reasonable, fair, and it needs to be a matter of priority. Otherwise, there will be many, many more stories that my honourable friend is talking about.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and yes, I totally agree with that. And at the very end, I will make a similar recommendation to what the honourable gentleman has referred to as well. And it does affect the low-income families. And although some of those figures I've mentioned for men and women, The figures also conceal very substantial variation within both genders. Lone parents in the bottom quintile, the bottom fifth of the household income distribution, lose some 25% of their net income, or £1 in every 4 on average. And I think it was the Honourable Lady, forgive me, I just can't remember our constituency, but she referred to it earlier on, and she referred to very clearly the income impact upon those in the lower income brackets. On average, disabled lone parents with at least one disabled child fare even worse, losing almost 3 out of every £10 of their net income. In cash terms, their average losses are almost £10,000 per year. That's massive. And we can't ignore those things. And those things really quite annoy me. And I think they annoy us all. And I think, to be fairness, they probably annoy the ministers as well. But we do need a response from yourselves to be able to do that. Around 1.5 million more children are forecast to be living in households below the relative poverty line. These are massive issues. And in Northern Ireland, in my constituency, the children in the poverty as a result of these reforms, I'm being perfectly honest, Madam Speaker, these things are happening in my constituency. And they're happening in everybody else's as well. We just had the rollout of universal credit quite recently, so therefore we know these things coming in almost like a storm coming in against people. The statistics carry on, but this gives a very clear picture to me. We're told that universal credit would be beneficial to households in need, and I have to say honestly, I do not see that happening at this moment. To see disabled homes being so massively affected is totally unacceptable. It's for this reason that I support the recommendations of the EHRC that the UK Government should, number one, monitor and publish the impact of welfare reforms on disabled people, including the assessment of the cumulative impact of tax and social security changes. And if you get those facts, I think they will tell the tale. Review the levels of benefits to ensure that they provide an adequate standard of living, because it's so important. People are falling into poverty, and children in particular. I always get annoyed when I hear of children in poverty levels. I think others get annoyed as well. And we also ensure that work coaches are trained to deliver tailored employment support. And how important that is to help the person get through. I think the Minister is nodding his head, and I think he accepts that issue, but we need to have people that can do that for them. And the specific needs of disabled people are being met. So we deal with them every day of the week in my office and everybody else's office. I'm not different from anybody else. We're all the same. And fourthly, make the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities part of the UK law. That's what the Honourable Gentleman referred to in his intervention. So that individuals can effectively challenge rights violations in the domestic legal system and develop a clear and coordinated plan for how the United Kingdom and devolved administrations will systematically address the UN's recommendations on disability rights. I've been contacted in the last 2 days by some constituents, and the Honourable Lady referred to, in her last penultimate paragraph, who spoke just before me, she referred to a quotation from some of her constituents. And they've asked me to highlight the fact that universal credit simply isn't working. Real-life responses from real people with real problems. They've asked me to make contact with the Department and with the Ministers in particular to ensure that their voices were heard in the midst of everything that has happened in this House today. And it's not just, I'm not going through all the things we all know, but I have a sore head just thinking about it. And I assured them that I would ensure I voiced the concerns today in the presence of the responding Minister. The concerns are, government states, no one falls through the cracks and ends up losing their benefit by making sure everyone claiming benefits under the old system is moved automatically onto universal credit and not forced to make a new claim. Government says no one is left without the money they need to survive by continuing to pay people all of their old benefits until the new ones have kicked in. Everyone is protected from becoming worse off under the new system, especially vulnerable groups. I say that's a very honourable assumption to make. There may be, I don't for 1 second don't say that's the purpose of what the government has put forward, but currently it is failing people. I know of many who went to the job centre and went through the online process with a member of staff, and then came into my office because the benefits office, or as we would have called it many years ago, the brew office is just right in the corner, and my office is within walking distance. So therefore, most of the people come to me when they have problems, or come to my staff members. And whenever they went through the online process with a member of staff and then came to my office in tears, as they simply couldn't understand what was happening to them. They couldn't understand that they hadn't got the benefits. They couldn't understand what the paperwork system was. And I don't want to be too critical, but I just have to say these things because they're exactly what has happened. people sick with worry, not understanding what is happening and really worried. And not understand what's required of them. Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm coming to the end. They are very worried about their benefit, and when we think that many of those who are on universal credit are ill, and the stress of this makes them things worse, it's clear that we are feeling. We are feeling the most vulnerable. As much as I would love to help every person on universal credit, my staff are doing nothing else in relation to that. Whilst I see, and I observe, by the way, that in the news that staff in one of the JBOs was enjoying a celebratory cake for doing an excellent job and seeing the end of this rollout in Northern Ireland. I tell you what, there wasn't much celebration in Newton Ours about it, and that's a fact. And there wasn't much celebration anywhere else. And that's not saying they shouldn't enjoy their cake. I'm just saying celebrate when it's good, but don't celebrate when it's not. The fact of the matter is that too many people are anxious and concerned. And, Madam Chair, I would ask the Minister to assure me and others in this House that there are changes on the way for the most vulnerable and the practicality of the rollout and changes and how it has affected all of those I listed earlier. I understand that we need all those who are able to work to do just that. And that's very constructive and helpful. And I probably, let's be honest, are people in benefits and sickness benefits because they want to be? No, they're not. They want to work the same as the rest of them. And it's perfectly plausible to put that forward. But I also understand that to force those who are not able to work to worry and make themselves ill is cruel and unnatural and must not happen. We need changes, yes. We need assurances as well, and we need action. And I look towards the Minister and his department as to how and when this will happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair.
Angela Crawley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I say I appreciate your fortitude at this time of evening. It's been a long week, and of course the previous chair as well. Now, I thank the Honourable Member for Oldham and Saddleworth for bringing forward this important debate, and for the Backbench Business Committee for granting this debate. For me, welfare reform has had a huge impact on my constituents, and in particular the lives of disabled people, not just in my constituency but across the UK. And regardless of the rhetoric of the benches opposite that welfare reforms are helping people back into work, the reality is that the conditions are getting harder for those who are most in need of assistance. Now, despite the calls from the War Against Welfare petition and the over 100,000 signatures submitted to the Government calling on the Government to introduce cumulative impact assessments, the Government has been unrelenting in introducing these changes, and it has earned the reputation for many of having a hostile environment when it comes to these changes. Welfare changes, coupled with the Government's austerity measures, notwithstanding the impact of Brexit and the potential of a further weakened economy, the reality is it will be the most vulnerable and the disabled who will be hardest hit by Brexit. And whether it's Brexit or the initial 2012 or 2016 welfare reforms, we have to acknowledge that these are not working as well as they could in practice. And that's not a political statement, it's just it's a matter of fact, they're not working as well as they could. Now, unlike some government department ministers, I know that the Minister of State for Disabled People cares deeply, and she will want to get this right. Now, of all the contributions we've heard across the House from right honourable and honourable members who have conducted themselves, can I say, immeasurably better in this chamber than in recent weeks, and they've served their constituents admirably better on this important matter, I think it is worth highlighting some of the valuable contributions that member for Oldham East and Saddleworth rightly highlighted the WOW campaign and the disproportionate impact on disabled people, families and carers. This is not a political statement, it's something that ultimately across this House we all want to get right, and I know that the Minister shares that same passion to get this right. Now, the members for Ayr, Carrick and Cumnock and Clacton, I'm sorry to say, gave a rather rosy depiction, and I'm afraid I don't share the same optimistic view, and I'm grateful to the member for Oakhill and South Perthshire for being a bit more realistic about the experience of his constituents, because the fact is there are elements of this that can be reviewed and reformed, and we all want to do that. Now, the honourable member for High Peak highlighted the range of cuts, and the member for Bishop and Auckland spoke passionately, as always, about the impact of WASPy women who are working longer and harder under the pension changes. The honourable member for Eastbourne rightly highlighted that many disabled constituents who want to work but can't, and it reminded me of the phrase that a good friend, Susan Douglas Scott, said to me, that often it's society that disables individuals, not the individuals themselves. Now, the Honourable Member for Aberystwyth and, I hope I said that right, and Bristol South, I tried my best, highlighted Bristol South as well, highlighted the UN report and the EHRC report and the joint calls for the cumulative impact assessments. And of course, no debate would be complete without the Honourable Member for Strangford, who needs no further words. My constituent, Liam, however, from Hamilton, has been trying to get the limited capability for work element for his universal credit, but so far been unsuccessful in his work capability assessment. His doctor, however, is adamant that Liam should not be working. Liam was a heavy goods courier, and after a work-related injury, he cannot stand for any length of time and cannot walk without fear of falling or his knees giving way. His experience of heart palpitations, high blood pressure and numbness of limbs and sleepless nights as a result of various medical treatments has meant that yet, despite this, it's not reflected in his medical assessment that did not reflect the gravity of his disabilities whatsoever, and many of the conclusions of the assessments were based on assumptions rather than evidence, and that seems to be a theme of many assessments. Liam is therefore required, as part of universal credit, to claim to search for jobs which he is physically unsuited and attend to training sessions for jobs that he simply cannot do. Now, this included a session with Remploy, the specialist charity for disabled employment, who are of course experts in this area, but they themselves refused to put Liam forward for any jobs because he was physically unsuitable for anything they could offer. It is a shame that Liam's in this position. He has a very strong work ethic and he wants nothing more than to get back to work. He's becoming increasingly frustrated by his situation because he's unable to provide for his children. He's a single parent with shared custody and often unable to see his own children because there is no food in the house and he's unable to feed them. Is it right that families should be forced to make these decisions? The fact is, the system is clearly flawed and not working, because this man cannot work, and yet he cannot even see his own children because he simply can't afford to feed them, and that's just heartbreaking to my mind. Now, for many who are claiming personal independence payments and employment support, the situation is not much better. The assessment criteria for these benefit assessments do not appear to have been written by disabled people with disabled people in mind. Rather, they're tick-box exercises carried out by ill-trained staff. And it's abundantly clear from many of the cases that I've come through that my office and the assessors do not pick up on all of the issues that are faced by disabled constituents. And yet I'm asked on a daily basis to advocate on their behalf when I don't even know the half of their situation or the magnitude of their disability. How can a work capability assessment or advisor assess that in less than 5 minutes, 20 minutes or half an hour? It's just not possible. So I think we've got to be completely realistic. Now, on Friday, I went to visit the local charity in my constituency, Esteem, who I sponsored this year for my annual Christmas card competition. And they support people with mental ill health, and they highlighted the experience of many of the clients who they face on a day-to-day basis who have gone to the job centre and have faced horrible experiences. And I know that's not the experience of every person, and I know that's not the intended purpose of any staff member who works at the local job centre. But the fact is, they've identified the Esteem charity that simply the employees and staff do not feel adequately trained and qualified to make an assessment of individuals, and they're bending over backwards to make it possible for people not to receive further cuts. They're doing everything they can. It's not the staff's fault that the policy is flawed, and I do not blame the staff for administering the policy set by this government. Now, the results of the inaccuracies reported to Department of Work and Pensions for these failed assessments or flawed assessment processes leads to a far lower amount of benefit given than what is needed to fit their circumstances and to give an accurate level of support. And in some instances, you have Department of Work and Pensions staff advising them not to switch over because it would be less beneficial for them. So if there's issues around the legacy system, there's issues around this system as well. If they're having to give that kind of advice to get people through the process, I think they have to acknowledge there are flaws and accept that that is the case. Now, having to fight to overturn a case causes huge stress to claimants, as well as putting extra pressure on agencies like the Citizens Advice Bureau and MPs' offices And it's admirable to hear members across this House going out of their way to support individuals to fill in forms and to go through mandatory reconsiderations and to get the right support. But ultimately, if the system worked as it should, we shouldn't be doing that, and we shouldn't have to do that. And that's not a good use of our resource or our staff or the process of this office at all to be doing that. So let's get to the root cause. I believe it demonstrates how ill fit for purpose the current system is. Now, another of my constituents, Dan, suffers from a chronic condition as well as mental health issues and has lost his entitlement to enhanced rate of personal independence payment and mobility in recent reassessment. The assessor has clearly not taken into consideration the full range of his needs. For example, he is personally deemed able to manage his own treatments. However, the reality is that he is solely reliant on his mother to take care of his medication and to wake him up every morning to make sure he gets the appropriate medication and support that he needs. He cannot do that on his own, and yet his mother's caring role was completely disregarded. And it was Dan's mother who approached my office, who helped to get the case over, and we helped to get that case overturned under mandatory reconsideration. But the point is, we shouldn't have to do that. The anxiety and the stress going through this process could have been avoided altogether if the assessment had been accurate in the first place. Now, another of my constituents approached my office after losing the motability element of his PIP reassessment through the fact that he had an adapted car. And it was necessary for him to get to appointments and for him to maintain his independence. However, the assessor who carried out the review found that he did not require help with mobility despite having lost one of his legs. He also lost all of his entitlement to PIP during that reassessment and again went through my office and had to undergo the process of mandatory reconsideration, not to mention the impact that dealt to his family, the shock and the stress and the senseless removal of support for the fact that he simply had no other alternatives. Now, this system can be, not always, but can be senseless and overly technocratic. It takes no account of how removing financial support or help like a mobility car will affect a disabled person and makes their lives far more difficult. In a similar case by Margaret from Curluke, she lost her mobility car when she transitioned from DLA to PIP, which left her housebound. She successfully disputed the length that she could walk and from the 20 to 50 metres in the assessment to the report which stated 1 to 20 metres. Unfortunately, Margaret, as she'd already been given back her motability car, had in the meantime gone out to buy another one. This meant having to correct the level of support. She was still in a position where her living standards were needlessly reduced by the reassessment process. Now, if this system works as well as we have heard by so many accounts that it does, when in reality, on the contrary, we, each and every day, every single one of our offices, have to support individuals to counter this system. The fact is, it just is not working as it should. So I think it's not unreasonable to say to the Minister that this offers an opportunity to ensure a thorough review and assessment of the criteria and ensure a meaningful involvement of disabled people and those with long-term conditions to ensure that the criteria is fair and truly reflective of the extra costs that people face and also the myriad of conditions that individuals encounter. Now, I welcome the comments from the Honourable Member for Oakland South Perthshire, who rightly admitted that continual review and assessment is required. So let me close by simply asking the Minister, if we can spend limitless amounts of money and resource on a Brexit and no deal planning for Brexit, then why can we not introduce an independent cumulative impact assessment on this government's welfare reforms? Thank you.
Thank you. Marsha de Cordova.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Oldham East and Saddleworth, for securing this important debate, and to the Backbench Committee for granting it. I also want to pay tribute and thank my right honourable friend, the member for Hayes and Harlington, for bringing a similar debate to this House 4 years ago. I pay tribute to his hard work as a champion for the rights of disabled people. I would also like to thank War on Welfare, I will refer to them now as WOW, campaigners, for their work over the past 6 years in making the voices of disabled people heard in this House, along with other disabled people's organisations and campaigners. Over 100,000 people signed the WOW petition, which first brought this debate here. And Madam Deputy Speaker, we have heard accounts today from honourable members from across the House. But I want to just mention just a few, particularly my honourable friend, the member for Bishop Auckland, who set out the devastating impact of cuts to social security, in particular the impact of the cut to the Motability scheme, where many individuals and disabled people have lost that vital support, and also the impact of the movement from many recipients from disability living allowance to the personal independence payment. And my honourable friend from Aberavon, who shared personal and powerful testimonies of his constituents, but also highlighting the shocking statistics in relation to the number of cases at tribunal that are overturned for both employment and support allowance and personal independence payments. Madam Deputy Speaker, today we are not asking the government to reveal the truth about the effects of cuts on disabled people. We're asking them to own up to creating a social security system for disabled people described by the UN's report on extreme poverty as callous, punitive and mean-spirited. A social security system that the UN Committee on the Rights of Disabled People has labelled as responsible for a grave, systematic human rights violations. A system that the Council of Europe concluded does not conform with the European Social Charters to rights for social security. We are demanding that the government own up to the effects of over £40 billion of cuts to disabled people's social security since 2010, to imposing a sanctions regime on sick and disabled ESA claimants, to a cruel and callous assessment framework for both PIP and ESA, and to the human catastrophe that is universal credit. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the last 8 years, disabled people have been forced to bear the brunt of the Tory austerity programme. They have been consistently and disproportionately impacted by cuts to social care, legal aid, housing, education and social security, as well as cuts to the Independent Living Fund. The Centre for Welfare Reform has found that disabled people had been hit 9 times harder by austerity than the rest of the population. Disabled people have been punished by this government's austerity agenda. They have been punished by the abolition of the disability living allowance and the introduction of the personal independence payment in 2013. And we know that the policy intention for abolishing DLA was to reduce expenditure on disability benefits by 20%, a move that has left hundreds and thousands of people without the support that they need, such as my constituent who suffers from chronic kidney disease and has been HIV positive for over 30 years, who was given 0 points at his PIP assessment, despite being unable to undress, prepare food for himself, and despite being in receipt of DLA for over 20 years. Disabled people have been punished by the gutting of the employment and support allowance, by the introduction of the 12-month time-limited payments for those on the contributions-based element, the tightening up of the criteria, and by the devastating cut to the ESA work-related activity component worth £30 per week, introduced in 2017 and which has hit over 50,000 people this year. And disabled people have been punished by an inaccurate and callous assessment framework which denies them dignity and respect. An assessment framework which has forced over 250,000 disabled people to take the DWP to tribunal to get the vital social security that they are entitled to, and where over 70% of PIP decisions brought to appeal tribunal are overturned. Since 2010, disabled people have been punished by the pointlessly cruel sanctions regime, which has hit more than 1 million disabled people in the past 8 years, and which the Welfare Reform Act ensured was more severe, more punitive and more long-lasting than ever before, resulting in disabled people facing severe debt and taking out loans because they have missed appointments at the job centre or because they didn't complete enough job applications. Figures released by the DWP last month show that 10% of ESA sanctions has lasted longer than 26 weeks, meaning sick and disabled people are losing 6 months' worth of their income. Madam Deputy Speaker, most importantly, disabled people face the government's flagship universal credit system, which acts as little more than a vehicle for cuts. Today's Work and Pensions Select Committee report has confirmed the devastating truth of the impact of universal credit on disabled people, of the structural problems inherent in universal credit, such as the 5-week wait and the online claim system that is inaccessible to many. Yes. Under universal credit, just 1 in 3 disabled people receive payments on time and in full, the rest having to wait weeks on end before receiving payment. Severely disabled people moving on to universal credit now are losing vital social security support that they need, in the form of the disability premiums, including the severe disability premium that they would have had under the legacy social security system, worth £64 per week. Payments which severely disabled people relied upon to cover those extra costs, such as ready-made meals or for help with household tasks. For one severely disabled person, universal credit meant that they received no money for 6 weeks, on top of losing their severe disability premium. The delays in payments and losing the premium meant that they were forced to go to their local authority for help, who gave them food vouchers so that they could actually have something to eat. In their words, they felt embarrassed and degraded by a system that left them destitute. It took a year for their universal credits to be sorted out, with endless calls which, I quote, were too physically and mentally painful for them to make. The government has made grave errors in cutting those disability premiums for those who are most in need. The transitional protection that this government were forced to give as a result of a High Court ruling earlier this year do not apply to new applicants or those who are naturally migrated on to universal credit, whose conditions remain the same, but who will lose that vital support. So I ask the Minister today, will she commit to ensuring that no severely disabled person who moves on to universal credit will lose their premiums? Madam Deputy Speaker, in the words of a wild petition campaigner, in the past 8 years, this government has created a hostile environment for sick and disabled people and has turned their lives into a living hell. It has created this hostile environment in the form of a punitive social security system that is stacked against them, and a system that is riddled with errors. Errors such as the underpayments of ESA to almost 200,000 claimants by this government. Disabled people have had to rely on the High Court to right the terrible wrongs in the social security system. In the past year alone, the High Court has found that the government unlawfully discriminated against hundreds and thousands of PIP claimants, and it unlawfully discriminated against severely disabled people with the loss of premiums. Madam Deputy Speaker, members on the opposite benches do continue to bury their heads in the sand at the suffering that they have caused over the past month. We've heard ministers, including the former Secretary of State, label cuts to disabled people as fake news, the issues surrounding universal credit as teething problems. They dismiss the findings of the UN investigation as politically motivated, and they dismiss calls to conduct a cumulative impact assessment which would offer a definitive analysis of the human costs of 8 years of austerity on disabled people. The UN Committee on the Rights of Disabled People and the Social Security Advisory Committee has joined this call to have this done. We know that the Equalities and Human Rights Commission has actually carried out this impact assessment, and it showed stark findings. We know the impact assessment can be done by the Treasury. If not, the Institute for Fiscal Studies can carry out this independent assessment. Madam Deputy Speaker, how many more disabled people have to suffer under this government's austerity programme? How many reports will the government link to the government's policies for mental health and suicide will they ignore? That the government refutes the findings of the UN on the effects of austerity on disabled people is shameful, but that it refuses to conduct an impact assessment of the human impact of their own policies is a downright denial.
Minister Sarah Newton.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd very much like to add my voice to those congratulating the Honourable Lady for securing such an important debate. And I think it goes to the great credit of this House that after what has been quite an emotional and long and tiring few weeks in this House, that members from every country of Great Britain are here tonight to speak up for their constituents so passionately and so well. And I think that is a great credit to this House. It's probably our last debate, our last full debate, before the adjournment debate tomorrow. And it's right that we focused on such an important issue as disabled people in our country, the amazing contribution that they make. And of course, for those that are very vulnerable and need our support, we quite rightly should be focusing all our efforts to see what more we can do. And I'm sure people across this House all want to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to make sure we live up to the ideals of the UN Conventions, of which we help design, the Disability Discrimination Act that a Conservative Prime Minister introduced into this House, the cross-party support for the Equalities Act, which underpins so much of what we're doing. These are important issues which should unite the House. And I'm pleased to hear a lot of really constructive comments this evening. But I really want to focus my remarks, because I've got so little time, I will not be able to answer all the questions, but I will write to honourable members if I haven't been able to address their concerns. But I really want to focus my few words that I've got on the motion, because it's such an important motion. And I want to reassure members that the government does publish distributional analysis of the cumulative impact of government decision on household finances at every fiscal event. Now, the last publication was in October to accompany the autumn budget and assess the tax, welfare and public spending changes announced from the autumn statement 2016 onwards that carry a direct quantifiable impact on households. The Treasury uses its intra-governmental tax and benefit micro-simulation model to produce this analysis, and the underlying data used for this model is from the Office of National Statistics Annual Living Cost and Food Survey. Now, HMT use this survey because it is the primary source of data about what income people have, how they spend their money, and what public services they have accessed. The LCF is unique in capturing all this information. Only by assessing the impact of government policy on each of these areas can an accurate and fully comprehensive assessment of total impact of all government policies on welfare, taxes and spending on public services be accurately assessed. To only look at one aspect, such as changes to income from benefits, does not provide a complete picture and is misleading. For example, this government has committed to increase spending on the NHS by £20 billion, which will have a positive and direct impact on the lives of millions of disabled people. And to only look at benefits would be really misleading. Now, the Living Cost and Food Survey came into existence in 2007, but a household food consumption and expenditure survey has been run by government since the 1940s. The primary purpose of these surveys has always been to collect detailed expenditure data for a sample of people, which is then used to assess changes in people's spending patterns, to adjust the basket of goods used to estimate inflation. The survey does not collect information from the sample of individuals that allows us to assess whether a person is disabled or not, and it's never been able to do that. As with all government surveys, taking part is voluntary, and a difficult balance has to be struck between the amount of information we are asking respondents to provide, and therefore the time that it takes to completing the survey, and the proportion of the sample willing to take part. Now, the survey sample is designed to be representative of the population, and the more people who do not respond, the more the estimates from the survey potentially suffer in terms of quality. So the lack of information about disability means that the information does not exist for the Treasury to estimate the cumulative impact of all government policies on disabled people. However, the Office for National Statistics are currently undertaking developments to their household surveys to integrate various surveys and also to link various sources of administrative data held by the government. That means it might be possible to have the required information on disability status in the future. They're consulting with users, and I've instructed my officials to raise the issue of disability status for the Living Cost and Food Survey, and would encourage all the members who care about this as much as I do and stakeholders to contact the ONS, because they are independent, and raise this issue with them. Because if we did have that information, and if they did proceed in the way that I've just described, linking data sets, it would be possible for us to undertake the sort of assessments that people have well articulated this evening. But although a cumulative impact assessment is not possible now, the DWP does undertake a wide range of other research and analysis to assess and monitor the impacts of policies on disabled people. DWP runs its own household survey called the Family Resources Survey. This collects information from a sample of households with detailed information on sources of income, the amount of income families receive, and also detailed information about the characteristics of people in those households. This survey, I have said that in order to answer the questions, I won't take interventions, but I will go back and write to any that I haven't been able to answer. This survey does collect the information required to make an assessment of the disability status of people in a household. And this information is then used to provide estimates of the amount of income that families with disabled people in them have. And the DWP publishes estimates of the numbers and percentages of people within households with disabled people who have low incomes in the annual Households Below Average Income publication. Now, in the 2016-17 survey, we saw that 16% of people in families where there was a disabled person in the category described as absolute low-income poverty before housing costs, with a weekly income after tax of £280 or less for a couple with no children, compared to 19% in 2009 and 10. So absolute low-income poverty on a before housing cost basis for families with a disabled person has actually improved by 3 percentage points since 2010. And looking at, can I just finish the point? And looking at all 4 measures of low-income poverty before and after housing costs, on a relative and an absolute basis, poverty for people in families with a disabled person has improved since 2010 for 3 out of the 4 measures, and there was no change in the 4th. Now, I am not complacent. 1 person living in poverty in this country is 1 too many, and that's why we were absolutely determined to do everything we can to put more money into people's pockets. But as well as this publication of poverty figures, let me make the points, because I've been asked to address a lot of issues here, and I really want to do that. Now, as well as the publication of the poverty figures, the Department for Work and Pensions publishes impact assessments for every new policy that carefully considers the potential impacts of these policies on those with protected characteristics, in line with its legal obligations and its strong commitment to promoting fairness. The DWP has a continual and broad programme of research and evaluation of policies affecting disabled people, often contracted to independent research bodies, and all the findings are published. A recent example of this kind of work was research into the experience of PIP claimants, which was published in September and provided valuable insights into how PIP was working to inform policy development. And I must say, we've had some appalling misuse of statistics tonight, because of all people who've applied for PIP, 9% have gone to appeal and 4% have been overturned. Now, I work with a great deal of colleagues in this House, with the select committees, with the APPGs, with disabled people and those people representing disabled people. And when we hear recommendations for how we can improve that process, we implement them. The Select Committee did an extremely valuable piece of work looking at assessments for ESA and PIP, and we are delivering on implementing those recommendations. And one of the members of the committee tonight raised the point about the video recording of PIP assessments, something I'm absolutely determined to see because I think it will restore a lot more confidence in the process. We spent the summer carefully speaking to people with disabilities, and let's not forget that it is fully qualified healthcare professionals that undertake these assessments. We spoke to them about these assessments and them being video recorded. Putting all of that information together, we started the live testing of PIP assessments only a few weeks ago. We'll have that work completed in the new year, and we will be able to report back to the Select Committee and to the House on the progress that we're going to make and how we're going to roll that out. Now, we're also undertaking a huge, large-scale test. It's actually the largest randomised control trial of its kind in the Western world, as well as research into the employment and sport package, to look at all the things that work to enable people with disabilities who want to work into work, because we know that there are many people with disabilities, and it was really interesting to listen to the personal experiences of the member for Eastbourne. There are many disabled people who want to work but face unacceptable barriers to work. And although we've made a lot of progress, the latest data from ONS shows that 900,000 more people are in work over the last 5 years. That is a steady increase in the employment rate from 43% to 51%. But we're very ambitious, and I want to see that gap close completely so that employers can draw on all the talents of the nation. And we have set ourselves the goal of 1 million more disabled people into work, and we are making good progress on that. Now, of course, not only are we helping those people who can work into work, but we're always looking at what more we can do to improve our main health and disability-related benefits. But let's be absolutely clear, we are spending record sums of money on these benefits. It's over £50 billion this year. It's much larger than our defence budget, and it's grown by more than £5.4 billion since 2010, and in every single year of this Parliament it is forecasted to rise. And all of those benefits that are about the additional costs of disability were not frozen. They were not part of the benefits cap, and including payments for carers. And so it is simply not true when people have said this evening that we've been reducing the amount of money that we spend on the social security system. I will.
For giving way. Professor Alston produced a punchy report, it's true, but it did make some very telling points. He referred to, and I quote, the dramatic decline in the fortunes of the least well-off in this country, but he added that the government has remained determinedly in a state of denial. It does sound from what she's saying as though she's confirming Professor Alston's point. Has there not been a dramatic decline in the fortunes of the least well-off?
You know, I was very pleased when the Honourable Lady opened this debate by saying she is an evidence-based policymaker. I am an evidence-based policymaker. I spent time on the Science and Technology Select Committee and was instrumental in having social science brought into the purview of that. I was on the board of the Parliamentary Office in Science and Technology. It's very, very important to me to make sure that we do use statistics and we use data and we use research accurately. What I am quoting from is independent, impartial information. Now, but as I said, one person in poverty is one too many. But let's not forget that we've had to deal with the legacy we were left by the last government. Oh, there is no money, and we've had to make very difficult choices about public expenditure, and we made sure that we increased the amount of money for people with disabilities, and we increased money for the NHS. The NHS and that extra money going into the NHS is directly benefiting people with health conditions and disability. So I have very little time to wind up, but what I want to say is that we've also talked about other barriers that people face to fulfilling their aspiration to play a full part in our society, and I completely agree with that. Employment is really important, but just as all of us this evening are going to go back to our constituencies, we're going to do some Christmas shopping, we're going to go to carol services, we're going to enjoy a panto. We're going to do things with our family. So many disabled people in our country will not be able to do that. So we are absolutely determined, through the work that we do with our sector champions, through the work that we do on our interministerial working groups, to make sure that every disabled person in our society can play their full part, and we'll remove those barriers, and we're absolutely committed to living up to the UN, all the UN standards which we've signed up to, absolutely certain to make those positive differences and changes.
Debbie Abrams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank again the Backbench Business Committee, all the contributors. You've been absolutely fantastic, highlighting what's happening in your constituencies up and down the country. But can I also thank the thousands of people that have been in contact with me over the last months and more recently this last few days. The DPOs, wow, DPAC and Inclusion, and many charities as well with their briefings, including the Centre for Welfare Reform, who said that this cumulative impact assessment is possible, and given that the Treasury accepts the EHRC's cumulative impact assessment modelling, it does seem rather bizarre that this Minister is saying that it can't happen. I'm conscious that if I don't finish before 9:36, we can't have a vote on this, Madam Deputy Speaker. So once again, can we all remember the stories that have been we have discussed this evening as we leave to go on our Christmas breaks? Thank you.
Thank you. The question is, as on the order papers, many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes have it.